I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows on the trees that surrounded me. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend away, just me and nature. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled my lungs as I stepped out of my car. The cabin looked old but sturdy. Its wooden walls were dark with age, and the porch creaked under my weight. I pushed the door open, and it swung wide with a loud groan. Inside, the place was bare, with just a table, a couple of chairs, and a small kitchen area. I set my backpack down and took a moment to soak it all in. This was my escape from the city, a chance to recharge and enjoy some solitude. After unpacking, I decided to explore the surrounding woods. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out the back door. The forest was dense, and the trees seemed to loom over me as I walked deeper into the wilderness. I followed a narrow path, listening to the crunch of leaves under my boots. Everything was quiet except for the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. As night fell, I headed back to the cabin, feeling a little uneasy. The woods were eerily silent now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia and focused on making a simple dinner. I cooked some pasta and sat at the table, the only light coming from my flashlight. After eating, I turned off the light and settled in for the night. The only sound was the wind howling outside. I tried to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. I felt restless, constantly aware of the darkness outside. Every creak of the cabin sent chills down my spine. Just when I thought I might finally doze off, I heard a noise outside. It was a soft rustling at first, then louder, like something moving through the underbrush. I froze, listening intently. My heart raced as the sound grew closer. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, illuminating the room with a harsh beam of light. The rustling stopped, and an unsettling silence enveloped the cabin. I waited, my breathing shallow. Then, suddenly, there was a loud bang against the door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I didn't know if I should open the door or stay put. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the door cautiously. With shaking hands, I slowly turned the knob and pulled the door open. The wind whipped against my face, and I squinted into the darkness. There was nothing there. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. The beam caught the edge of the woods, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move, something large and dark. My heart raced again, and I quickly stepped back inside, slamming the door behind me. I locked the door, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was just a deer, I told myself, trying to calm down. I decided to call it a night. I sat on the couch, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The minutes dragged on, and I could still hear the wind outside, but the rustling had stopped. Finally, exhaustion took over, and I lay down on the couch, keeping the flashlight on beside me. I fell into a fitful sleep, waking up a few times to the sound of twigs snapping outside. Each time, my heart would race, and I'd grip the flashlight tighter. When morning finally came, I felt relieved but drained. I got up and stepped outside, the sun shining brightly now. The woods looked so different in the daylight, bright and inviting, with birds chirping cheerfully. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the night's fears. Deciding I needed to clear my head, I set out for a walk. As I walked deeper into the forest, I noticed tracks in the soft ground. They looked like large animal prints. A sense of unease crept back, but I pressed on. After a while, I stumbled upon a small clearing with a stream running through it. I knelt by the water, washing my face and splashing the cool liquid over my head. As I sat there, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. Nature had a way of grounding me, and I felt grateful for the beauty around me. Suddenly, I heard something again, a low growl coming from behind the trees. My heart dropped as I turned to look. That's when I saw it. A massive bear, standing at the edge of the clearing, staring right at me. Panic surged through me and instinct kicked in. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on the bear. I remembered the advice I had read. Don't run. Bears can run faster than you. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. As I stepped back, the bear seemed to lose interest and turned away, lumbering back into the woods. I didn't breathe a sigh of relief until I was safely back at the cabin. I spent the rest of the day inside, thankful to be alive. I packed my things and prepared to leave, feeling more alert and appreciative of my surroundings. I drove away from the cabin, promising myself to return someday, not just for the adventure, but for the reminder that nature can be both beautiful and dangerous. I had been looking forward to this weekend all month. After weeks of work stress, I finally rented a cabin deep in the woods. I wanted to disconnect and enjoy some peace and quiet. The drive there was beautiful, with tall trees lining the road and the sun filtering through the leaves. I felt my tension ease with every mile I traveled. When I arrived, the cabin was just as I imagined. Rustic, cozy, and surrounded by nature. The wooden walls had a warm, inviting smell, and the small fireplace in the corner added to the charm. I quickly unpacked my bag and settled in. I planned to spend my days hiking and my nights reading by the fire. Everything felt perfect. As night fell, I built a fire and made some coffee. I stared out the window at the darkening woods, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. However, the serenity didn't last long. I started to hear noises outside. At first, I dismissed them as animals, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the sounds grew louder, and I could swear I heard something moving around near the cabin. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I turned up the music, hoping to drown out the sounds. But every now and then, I'd catch a noise that made my heart race. A branch snapping, a rustle in the leaves. I decided to go outside for a moment to see if I could spot anything. Maybe it was just a curious animal. I stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around me. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The woods felt alive with sounds, but I didn't see anything, just the shadows of the trees dancing in the light. I took a deep breath and headed back inside, feeling foolish for letting my imagination run wild. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin made me jump, and I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see something lurking in the darkness. As the hours passed, I finally dozed off, but it wasn't for long. I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart raced as I lay still, straining to listen. The noise came again, louder this time, from the back of the cabin. I got up, my legs shaky, and grabbed a heavy flashlight. I crept to the back door, my mind racing with what could be out there. I opened the door slowly, holding my breath. The air was still, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows everywhere. I felt like I was being watched. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I swung the flashlight towards it, and my heart stopped. A figure was standing just beyond the tree line, partially hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel the weight of its gaze on me. Panic surged through me. I stepped back inside and locked the door, my hands trembling. I leaned against it, breathing hard, trying to calm myself down. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I felt completely isolated, trapped in the cabin with whatever was outside. The banging started again, this time louder and more insistent. It was coming from the side of the cabin. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, but I knew I couldn't just sit there. I needed to figure out what was going on. I crept to the side window, my heart pounding. I peered out, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The figure was closer now, standing right against the cabin. It was a man, dirty and wild-looking, with a crazed look in his eyes. My breath caught in my throat as I realized he was trying to get in. I quickly ducked away from the window and rushed to grab anything I could use as a weapon. I found a heavy iron skillet in the kitchen and clutched it tightly, feeling its weight reassuring. The banging continued, and I could hear him mumbling, though I couldn't make out the words. My mind raced. I needed to escape. I remembered there was a small window in the bathroom. It was a tight fit, but it might be my only chance. I dashed toward it, my heart pounding in my ears. I opened the bathroom window and pushed it wide, squeezing through as fast as I could. I fell to the ground outside, scraping my arms but not caring about the pain. I took off running into the woods, not looking back. The darkness surrounded me, but I kept moving, desperate to get away. I ran until I couldn't hear the banging anymore, only the sound of my heavy breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. I eventually stumbled onto a dirt road and kept running, hoping to find someone to help. After what felt like hours, I finally reached a small farmhouse. I pounded on the door until someone answered, an older man looking confused and worried. I told him what had happened, and he immediately called the police. They arrived and searched the area around the cabin. I was shaken but relieved when they found no sign of the man. The officers assured me that they would keep an eye on the area and advised me to report the incident when I got home. The next day, I packed up and left the cabin behind. I had gone there to find peace, but instead, I found fear and danger. As I drove away, I took one last look at the cabin, knowing I would never return. I had learned a valuable lesson about trusting my instincts and being aware of my surroundings. What was meant to be a peaceful getaway turned into a harrowing experience, but I felt grateful to be safe and alive. I promised myself that I would choose my next adventure more wisely. I decided to spend a weekend at a cabin in the woods, far away from the noise of the city. I had found it online, and the photos showed a small, rustic place surrounded by tall trees and a quiet lake. I imagined it would be the perfect escape to clear my mind. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the pictures. It was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace and a wooden deck overlooking the lake. I unloaded my bags, set up my things, and felt excited about the peaceful days ahead. The first night, I sat on the deck, enjoying the cool air and the sounds of nature. Felt like a dream. As night fell, I lit a fire inside the cabin. The warm glow of the flames was comforting. I made some food and relaxed, feeling completely at ease. But as the night grew darker, an uneasy feeling crept in. The woods around me were silent. Not a single sound broke the stillness. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but something felt off. I went to bed early, hoping to shake off my worries, but sleep came slowly. I kept hearing sounds outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling. Each noise pulled me from my dreams, and I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. Just when I thought I could sleep, a loud bang echoed from the back of the cabin. My heart raced. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and tiptoed to the door. I opened it slowly, the cool air hitting my face. I aimed the flashlight into the darkness. The beam danced across the trees, revealing nothing. I took a deep breath and stepped outside. I felt foolish for being scared, but the woods were thick, and it was hard to shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to check the back of the cabin, where the noise had come from. I walked carefully, trying to be quiet. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered. I tapped it, hoping to get more light, but it died. Panic set in, and I turned to head back to the cabin. As I did, I heard something moving behind me. It was low and soft, like something dragging along the ground. I hurried to the door, my heart pounding. I slammed it shut and locked it. I leaned against the door, breathing heavily. I was alone in the woods, with only my thoughts and that sound outside. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a raccoon or a deer, but the woods felt too quiet, too still. After a restless night, morning finally arrived. I opened the door cautiously, peering outside. Everything looked normal, the sun shining through the trees. I stepped out, looking for any signs of what had happened. That's when I noticed the footprints in the soft dirt near the cabin. They were large and unmistakably human. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I wasn't just alone. Someone had been near my cabin while I slept. I grabbed my things and decided it was best to leave. I packed quickly, my hands shaking. As I loaded my car, I kept looking around, half expecting to see someone watching me. Once everything was in the trunk, I got in the car and drove away. The gravel road felt bumpy beneath me, and I tried to shake off the fear gripping my chest. As I made my way back to the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin looked peaceful, almost inviting, but I knew better. I promised myself I would never return to that cabin again. The woods could hide many things, but it was clear that some of those things were not friendly. I drove back to the city, grateful for the sounds of traffic and people. The experience taught me that solitude can be both beautiful and frightening. And sometimes, it's best to heed the warning signs and leave the dark places behind. I decided to spend the weekend at my uncle's old cabin in the woods. It was a place I used to love visiting as a kid, but now it felt different, darker and more isolated. I packed my bags and drove out, excited to enjoy some quiet time away from the city. When I arrived, the cabin stood as it always had, wooden, rustic, and surrounded by towering trees. The air was fresh, and the only sound was the gentle rustle of leaves. I unloaded my things, lit a fire in the small stone fireplace, and settled in with a book. The warmth of the fire was comforting, and I felt the stress of my daily life begin to fade away. That night, as the sun set and darkness filled the woods, I heard strange noises outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard something that sounded like footsteps crunching on the leaves. I brushed it off as animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon. After all, I was in their territory. But the noises grew louder. I felt my heart race as I listened, straining to hear what was out there. It was too quiet for too long, and then suddenly, a loud bang came from the back of the cabin. I froze. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the back door, every creak of the floorboards beneath me echoing in the stillness. I hesitated, my hand trembling on the doorknob. Finally, I opened the door just a crack and peeked outside. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I stepped outside, still feeling uneasy but determined to confront whatever was making those noises. The light from the flashlight flickered slightly as I walked around the cabin. I noticed some broken branches and a few disturbed leaves, but nothing looked out of place. Just as I was about to head back inside, I heard a low growl coming from the woods. I spun around, heart pounding, and shone my light toward the sound. The beam illuminated a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. It was too big to be a raccoon. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to get back inside. I rushed into the cabin, locked the door, and leaned against it, breathing heavily. I could hear the growling getting closer, mixed with heavy breathing. It felt like something was out there, watching me. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off. I spent the rest of the night on edge, listening to the noises outside and praying for morning to come. The growling continued, but eventually, it faded away as the night wore on. I tried to rest, but every little sound made me jump. When the first light of dawn broke, I cautiously looked outside. The woods were calm and peaceful, the danger of the night before seeming to vanish with the sunlight. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the area. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Deciding it was time to leave, I packed up my things quickly. As I was loading my car, I noticed something in the dirt near the back of the cabin. It was a large paw print, too big to belong to any ordinary animal. My heart sank as I realized I might not have been alone after all. I got in my car and drove away, the cabin disappearing behind me. I felt a strange mix of relief and fear. I would never return to that cabin again. The woods were beautiful, but I now knew they could hide dangers I never expected. I learned to respect the wilderness and its secrets, leaving the cabin and its mysteries behind. I had always loved the idea of escaping to a cabin in the woods. After a tough year, I finally decided to treat myself to a weekend away. The cabin was small but cozy, nestled deep in a forest, far from the noise of the city. I arrived just as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I felt a rush of excitement as I unloaded my car and settled in. The first night was peaceful. I lit a fire, made some dinner, and sat outside, listening to the sounds of the forest. The chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves created a calming atmosphere. I felt relaxed, finally free from the stress of my daily life. As darkness fell, I went inside, leaving the door slightly ajar to let in the cool breeze. As I lay in bed, I listened to the sounds outside. Suddenly, I heard something that made me sit up. It was a faint rustling noise coming from the direction of the woods. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but deep down, I felt a strange sense of unease. I got up and looked outside, but the darkness made it hard to see anything. I shrugged it off, crawled back under the blankets, and tried to sleep. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I hiked a nearby trail, taking in the beauty of the trees and the fresh air. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder a few times, but saw nothing. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the sounds of nature around me. Eventually, I returned to the cabin, hoping to shake off the strange feeling. That night, I stayed in, opting to watch a movie on my laptop. As I settled in, the same rustling noise returned, louder this time. I paused the film and listened. It sounded like footsteps, crunching through the leaves. My heart raced, and I grabbed a flashlight, shining it out the window. There was nothing but darkness. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The third night, I decided to go to bed early. I was exhausted from my hike and just wanted some rest. I locked the door behind me, feeling a little safer. But as I lay there, sleep wouldn't come. The rustling had grown more persistent. I was sure it was getting closer. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and walked to the window. My flashlight flickered as I shined it toward the sound. My heart dropped when I saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, too far away to make out any details, but I could see it was watching the cabin. I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly backed away from the window and grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight feature. I needed to see if it was still there. I peered outside again, but the figure was gone. The forest was quiet, but I felt a heaviness in the air. I decided to call it a night, hoping the figure was just a figment of my imagination. The next day, I decided to pack up and leave early. I was tired of feeling scared in a place that was supposed to be relaxing. As I loaded my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced back at the cabin one last time. That's when I noticed something strange. The front door, which I had locked, was slightly ajar. My heart raced again as I realized I had not left it open. I quickly got into my car and drove away, not looking back. The feeling of being watched lingered even as I left the woods behind. But I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I hit the main road, finally safe. I promised myself I'd never go back to that cabin again. The woods may have their beauty, but they also held secrets best left undisturbed. I learned that some places are not meant to be explored alone, and not all getaways lead to relaxation. I drove home with my heart pounding but grateful to be away from the fear that had haunted me during my stay. As I pulled into my driveway, I took a deep breath, thankful to be in a familiar place, far from the unsettling whispers of the woods. I decided to spend the weekend at a small cabin in the woods. I was tired of the city and needed a break. The cabin was old but cozy, tucked between tall trees. I had everything I needed: food, a few books, and my trusty flashlight. As the sun began to set, I felt a strange excitement in the air. That evening, I settled in and made a small fire outside. The crackling of the wood was calming, and the smell of smoke filled my lungs. I roasted some marshmallows and watched the sky turn dark. Once the sun disappeared, the woods became silent, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt a chill run down my spine as I sat alone. I shook it off. I was just being paranoid. After a while, I went inside the cabin. The walls creaked as I moved, and the wind howled outside. I grabbed a book and tried to read, but I couldn't focus. Something felt off. I put the book down and looked out the window, scanning the darkness. I thought I saw something moving between the trees, but I blinked, and it was gone. The night wore on, and I decided to go to bed. I turned off the lights and lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds outside. I thought about the stories of wild animals and the dangers of the woods. My mind raced with thoughts as I tried to sleep. Just as I started to drift off, I heard a loud crash. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. Came from outside. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the door. My hands shook as I opened it, and the cold air hit me hard. I shined the light into the trees. Nothing, just the shadows of the branches swaying in the wind. Trying to calm myself, I stepped outside and noticed a broken branch on the ground. I figured it must have fallen, so I turned to go back inside. That's when I saw it, a shape not too far from the cabin. It was tall and dark, standing still in the shadows. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. After a moment, I gathered my courage and shouted, "Hello!" My voice echoed in the stillness, but there was no response. The figure didn't move. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but I stood my ground, shining the flashlight at the figure. The beam of light revealed nothing. The space was empty, but I could still feel something was out there, watching me. I backed away slowly, my instincts screaming to get inside. I didn't dare look back until I reached the safety of the cabin. I locked the door and sat in silence, listening to the night. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Finally, I decided to turn on my phone to check the time. The battery was almost dead. Panic surged through me. I needed to charge it and call for help, but I had no signal. I spent the rest of the night in a restless state, glancing at the windows, expecting to see that figure again. The fire had died down, leaving the cabin cold. As dawn approached, I heard the sounds of the forest coming to life. Birds chirped, and the light began to seep through the trees. I gathered my things, determined to leave the cabin behind. I didn't want to stay another minute. As I opened the door, I saw the broken branch again. But this time, something was off. There were footprints in the dirt, leading away from the cabin into the woods. My heart raced. I wasn't alone. I hurried to my car, my eyes darting around for any sign of movement. I got inside and locked the doors. I fumbled with the keys, almost dropping them. As the engine roared to life, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I sped away from the cabin, not daring to look back. Driving back to the city, I kept replaying the events in my mind. I was thankful to be safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I promised myself I'd never return to that cabin. Sometimes, it's best to leave the unknown behind, especially when the woods are dark and quiet. I had been looking forward to this weekend getaway for weeks. My friends and I planned a trip to an old cabin deep in the woods. It was supposed to be a break from our busy lives. Just us, the fresh air, and the peaceful sounds of nature. As we drove up, the road got narrower, and the trees closed in around us. I felt a sense of excitement mixed with a bit of unease. The cabin was old but charming, nestled among towering pines. I could smell the pine needles and damp earth as we unloaded our bags. Once inside, I was struck by the cozy atmosphere. The wooden walls smelled of cedar, and the fireplace looked like it could warm us up on a chilly night. We lit a fire, and the flickering light created dancing shadows on the walls. I felt safe, surrounded by friends, even though the forest outside was dark and thick. That first night, we played games and told stories by the fire. But as the hour grew late, I noticed a change in the air. The wind began to howl outside, making the trees sway ominously. I tried to shake off my unease. It was just the wind, I told myself, but something didn't feel right. The next morning, I woke early to the sound of birds chirping. I decided to take a walk while the others were still asleep. I stepped outside and was hit by the cool morning air. The forest was beautiful, sunlight streaming through the branches. I wandered a bit too far, losing track of time and my surroundings. When I finally turned back, I realized I couldn't see the cabin anymore. Panic rose in my chest as I hurried back. When I returned, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar, but I was sure I had closed it. I pushed it open cautiously, calling out to my friends. The cabin was silent. I checked each room, but no one was there. I felt a chill run down my spine. Where had they gone? I searched the cabin again, looking for any signs of my friends. Their things were still in the living room, but they were nowhere to be found. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. My heart raced as I stepped back outside, scanning the woods for any sign of them. After searching for what felt like hours, I started to feel hopeless. The woods were dense, and it seemed like I was surrounded by walls of trees. Then I heard a noise. A rustling came from the bushes nearby. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I slowly turned to face the noise, my heart pounding. A figure emerged from the trees. It was one of my friends, dirty and disheveled. Relief flooded over me, but as I reached out to hug him, I noticed the wild look in his eyes. He grabbed my arm and pulled me back. "We need to leave. Now," he said urgently. I could hear the fear in his voice. He explained that while he was out gathering firewood, he had seen something in the woods, something watching him. My mind raced with questions, but I didn't have time to ask. I just nodded, feeling the same fear grip me. We quickly gathered our things and started walking back to the car. As we moved through the trees, I felt like eyes were watching us, hidden among the branches. Every rustle made me jump. I could see the cabin getting smaller behind us, and I felt a strange relief. When we finally reached the car, we jumped inside and locked the doors. We drove away, the cabin disappearing behind us. My heart still raced, but the further we got, the more I began to calm down. My friend and I exchanged worried glances but didn't speak. Once we were safely on the road, I could finally breathe. We didn't talk about what happened. I think we both understood that some things are better left unsaid. I'll never forget that cabin or the feeling of being watched in the woods. It was a trip I had hoped would be relaxing, but it became a story of survival. Now, I appreciate the quiet and safety of my home more than ever. Sometimes, it's good to remember that not all adventures are meant to be taken lightly. I never thought a weekend at the cabin would change my life. I found the place online. A small, rustic cabin deep in the woods. The pictures showed a cozy space surrounded by tall trees and a peaceful lake. I packed my bags with excitement, ready for a break from my busy life. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the photos. The wooden walls creaked, and the air smelled of pine. I set my things down and took a moment to enjoy the silence. I was far away from city noise and the stress of work. As night fell, I lit a fire in the fireplace and settled in with a book. The flickering flames created shadows on the walls, and I felt cozy and safe. But as I turned the pages, I heard something outside. At first, it was a soft rustling, like leaves blowing in the wind. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the wind. However, the sound got louder. It was more like footsteps, heavy and slow. My heart raced as I listened closely, wondering if I should check it out. Instead of going outside, I grabbed a flashlight and turned off the cabin lights. I pointed the beam through the window but saw nothing. The darkness outside was thick and unnerving. I tried to convince myself it was probably just an animal. I pulled my blanket tighter around me and tried to ignore the feeling of dread creeping into my mind. Just as I began to relax again, I heard a loud bang against the cabin door. I jumped, my heart pounding. Fear took over. I set the flashlight down and crouched behind the couch, listening intently. There was another bang, then silence. I didn't want to imagine what could be out there. I could hear my breath echoing in the quiet. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to peek through a crack in the curtains. The beam of my flashlight revealed nothing but the dark trees swaying in the wind. My mind raced with thoughts. Was someone trying to scare me? Or was it something worse? I decided I wouldn't open the door no matter what. As the night dragged on, I heard more noises, twigs snapping and rustling outside. I kept my flashlight handy, shining it around every time I heard a sound. I convinced myself I'd be okay as long as I stayed inside. My phone had no signal, and I realized I was completely alone. I thought about calling for help, but who would hear me out here? Suddenly, the power went out. The darkness felt suffocating, and the quiet was deafening. I scrambled to find my flashlight, heart racing even faster now. I turned it on, but the beam felt weak. I sat in the corner of the room, feeling trapped and scared. The noises stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Just as I thought I could catch a break, there was a loud crash at the back of the cabin. It sounded like something heavy had fallen over. Panic surged through me, and I jumped to my feet. I thought about escaping out the front, but the thought of what might be waiting outside stopped me. I felt trapped between my fear of the dark and the unknown outside that I took a deep breath and made a plan. I would wait until dawn. I knew that with the light, I could see if there was any real danger. Until then, I'd stay quiet and hidden. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the fear. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like a lifetime. Finally, the first light of dawn peeked through the cracks in the cabin. I opened my eyes and felt a bit of hope. I slowly crept to the window, peeking outside. What I saw made my heart sink. A fallen tree lay across the back porch, and the door was wide open, swinging on its hinges. I grabbed my bag and quietly moved toward the door. It felt surreal, like I was in a nightmare. I stepped outside, the fresh morning air hitting me like a wave. I scanned the area, but it was empty. Just me, the cabin, and the forest. I quickly made my way to my car, heart still pounding, half expecting something to jump out at me. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. It looked ordinary in the daylight, but I knew it would never feel safe to me again. I felt lucky to have escaped whatever had been lurking there. That weekend at the cabin changed me. It taught me to respect the woods and reminded me how fragile safety can be. I would always remember that eerie night and the fear that kept me awake. From then on, I decided that sometimes it's better to be surrounded by people than to seek solitude in the unknown. I decided to spend a weekend in a cabin I had rented deep in the woods. It was meant to be a quiet getaway from the chaos of city life. The cabin was small and rustic, surrounded by tall trees and the sound of a flowing river nearby. I was excited to disconnect and enjoy the peace. As I settled in, I noticed a strange feeling in the air. It was a bit too quiet, even for the woods. I tried to shake it off and went outside to explore. I wandered down to the river, the sunlight sparkling off the water. Everything seemed fine until I spotted something unusual. A pile of what looked like old clothes was partially hidden behind a bush. I felt a chill run down my spine but pushed the thought away. That night, I built a fire outside and cooked some dinner. The flames danced, and I tried to enjoy my meal, but the unease returned. Every sound in the dark felt amplified. The rustle of leaves, the crackling of twigs. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. As I prepared to head to bed, I noticed a flickering light in the distance. It was faint, but it seemed to be moving. My heart raced as I stepped closer to the window. The light was coming from deeper in the woods, swaying back and forth. I felt compelled to investigate, despite every rational part of me screaming to stay inside. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured out, trying to be as quiet as possible. The light flickered again, moving further away. I followed it, the beam of my flashlight bouncing on the trees. It was eerie and dark. The only sounds were my footsteps and the distant rustling of animals. The light led me to a small clearing, and there it was, a lantern, old and rusty, hanging from a tree branch. I approached cautiously. My instincts told me to turn back, but curiosity drove me forward. As I examined the lantern, I noticed something on the ground. A small diary, its pages worn and yellowed. I picked it up, and as I flipped through it, I realized it belonged to someone named Jake. The entries were unsettling, detailing strange noises in the woods, a feeling of being watched, and the disappearance of others who had come to stay in the area. Suddenly, a loud crash came from behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. The darkness felt thicker, as if it were closing in. I shone my flashlight into the trees, but all I saw were shadows. Panic surged through me, and I sprinted back toward the cabin, adrenaline pushing me to move faster than I thought possible. I burst through the door, locking it behind me. My hands shook as I tried to steady my breath. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The only light came from my flashlight, and I sat in the corner of the cabin, listening intently. Hours passed, and the sounds of the night grew louder. I could hear branches snapping and the occasional rustle, but I couldn't see anything outside. I felt trapped, like a prey waiting for something to pounce. I thought about the diary and what it might mean. Had others felt this way? Had they sensed danger too? As dawn approached, I saw the first light of morning creeping through the windows. I took a deep breath, feeling slightly more secure with the sun rising. I needed to get out of there, and the daylight would help. I packed my things quickly, still shaken from the night's events. Before leaving, I took one last look around the cabin. My eyes landed on the diary, and I felt a strange urge to leave it behind. I placed it back on the table where I had found it, hoping the next visitor would read it and take heed. I locked the cabin and drove away, relief flooding over me as the trees thinned out. When I reached the road, I looked back at the cabin, a small figure now framed by the rising sun. I realized that sometimes the woods hold more than just beauty. They keep secrets. I drove on, grateful to have escaped, but knowing I'd always remember that strange, unsettling night. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The plan was simple: spend a weekend alone in a cabin in the woods. I wanted to escape the noise of the city and find some peace. When I arrived, the cabin looked cozy and inviting, surrounded by tall trees and a calm lake. I felt hopeful and excited as I settled in. As the sun began to set, the woods changed. Shadows grew longer, and the sounds of the night became louder. I lit a fire in the fireplace and made some coffee, enjoying the warmth. But as darkness enveloped the cabin, I began to feel uneasy. It was too quiet, and my mind played tricks on me. Every crack of a branch outside made my heart race. I decided to explore the area, thinking it would help me feel better. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The beam of light danced across the trees, illuminating the underbrush. The air was chilly, and the silence pressed against me like a weight. As I walked, I noticed something odd. There were no animal sounds, no chirping of crickets, nothing at all. It was as if the forest held its breath. After a while, I stumbled upon a small clearing. In the middle of it stood a large rock, and next to it, I saw something that made my stomach twist. A pile of bones lay scattered on the ground. Animal bones, but they looked old, worn, and weathered. I shuddered at the thought of what could have caused this. I turned back toward the cabin, my heart pounding, feeling a primal urge to get back inside. Once I returned, I locked the door and tried to calm my nerves. I settled into a chair by the fire, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard a noise outside, a low, scratching sound against the cabin walls. My heart raced as I listened closely. It stopped, then started again, this time moving around the cabin, following my every movement inside. I felt frozen, unable to act. The scratching grew louder, and I could hear breathing, heavy and raspy, on the other side of the wall. Panic surged through me. I grabbed a heavy flashlight, knowing it was my only defense. I could see a shadow move outside the window, and the sound of claws scraping intensified. I was sure it was some wild animal, but something deep inside told me it was more than that. I took a deep breath and opened the front door, shining my flashlight into the darkness. There was nothing there. I stepped outside, heart pounding, scanning the area. Suddenly, a movement caught my eye. I turned quickly to see a dark figure dart behind a tree. Adrenaline surged through me. I shouted, "Who's there?" But only silence answered. Realizing I had to get out, I quickly gathered my things and jumped into my car. I felt exposed and vulnerable. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. In the fading light, I saw a figure standing on the porch, watching me leave. I could feel its gaze on my back as I sped down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I found a motel and checked in, still shaking. I thought about that cabin, how peaceful it had seemed at first, but how quickly it turned into a nightmare. I learned that night that sometimes what seems calm and inviting can hide dark secrets. I vowed never to return to the woods again. The next morning, as I packed my things to leave the motel, I felt a strange relief mixed with fear. I was safe, but the memory of the cabin haunted me. I glanced at the forest in the distance, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement among the trees. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. I drove away, grateful to be free from that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, lingering in the shadows of the woods.